either. This is fourth time. And Professor Dabis, the lecture will be divided into two. Today and next week, 8 October. And shorter than usual. Okay? And let me introduce a little bit biography of Professor Dabis. Professor Dabis is a French medical doctor, now Professor of Epidemiology of ISPED. ISPED is Institut de Santé Publique, Épidémiologie et de Développement in French, ISPED, Public Health Institute for Public Health, Epidemiology, and Development. Okay, and he is very well known by his work in HIV/AIDS control, prevention and care of HIV/AIDS in African countries. He has been working on HIV issue, prevention and care of HIV in Africa since 25 years ago, almost 30 years ago. So since the beginning of this big epidemic, HIV/AIDS, he has been in the field of Africa epidemiology study. So he has many publications, and he has many cohort study. Maybe you know cohort. Cohort. For epidemiology or field study, making cohort is something very important. So I cannot explain very well, but cohort is, the place where you start the epidemiologic study. So sometimes prospective, sometimes retrospective. Mainly prospective. Prospective study, that means from, for example, Tsukuba City. Let's imagine Tsukuba City is a cohort. And you study about, for example, some infectious diseases, how often it occur, how severe, and so on. Such kind of epidemiological study, prospective. In that situation, you need a cohort. So what he made is many big, very big cohort. So anyway, he is very well known by his work, epidemiological work on HIV/AIDS. And amazingly, he has started his work already at late 1980. Do you remember? HIV/AIDS has happened the first time 1981. It's the first case in United States. But apparently before that, there were already patients. So from very early stage, late 1980, he started already such biggest cohort study in Rwanda. Amazing. And not only Rwanda, but also Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, and not only such developing countries, but also in Brazil and within France and so on. His group has many cohort studies. So, and also what I would wanted to add is his relationship between him and Japan. When he was young, like you, he came already. When he was a medical student, he came to Japan to spend 2 months in Kitazato Institute. Maybe some of you know Kitazato Institute. Kitazato Shibasaburo, do you know? Japanese scientist, Japanese medical doctor who discovered cholera. And so there is an institute named with his name, Kitazato Kenkyujo in Tokyo. He came there when he was young, when he was medical student, backpacking. So he was so courageous, like you. And he spent already 2 months. And as I was very much attracted by his group's work on prevention of transmission of HIV/AIDS from mother to child, I have contacted him. I went to Bordeaux, and I asked collaboration with his group. Since then, we are friends. And kindly, he received 3 times invitation to Japan. So 2 years ago, he came to Tsukuba and gave his lecture like today. And he was invited at the same time by JICA, and he presented there in JICA, Japan. And 4 or 5 years ago, he was invited to Japanese conference on international health cooperation or something, and the international tropical medicine. So he gave a keynote lecture. And this time, this is the 3rd time, but at the same time, you know, from today, it is Tsukuba Global Science Week to celebrate 40 years of Tsukuba University. So tomorrow morning, he will give a keynote lecture from 8:30 in Kokusai Kaigijo tomorrow. So he was invited for that also this time. So I did not give yet to this year's students my lecture on infectious diseases. So maybe most of you don't know much about HIV/AIDS, but as you might know, you might know already the name of AIDS. Okay? Nobody. Okay? So I would say that HIV/AIDS is one of global infectious diseases which kill today also 1 million, about 1 million still are killed every year. So this is a big global infectious diseases which are related environmental study also. Always global infectious diseases are related to environment. So environmental students should know the minimal knowledge about HIV/AIDS, I think. So please listen carefully his lecture, and if you have comment and question, don't hesitate any comment and question. Okay?
Thank you, Naomi. Merci beaucoup, and good afternoon. Do you understand my English? Because I'm not an English speaker by origin. Yes? Should be fine? Yes. Okay, good. So as Naomi said, I've been here already, and I really appreciate the hospitality and your time to spend here with me. Tomorrow the lecture will be slightly different, but on the same theme. But I can spend a little bit more time with you, and also I'd like to discuss rather than just give a lecture. So if possible, so I'd like to have some interaction. So don't hesitate to say, I disagree, or I don't understand what you're talking about, or what if something during today and next week. So please. So as Naomi said, I come from Bordeaux in France, the university which has joint partnership with this university, and I come particularly from the School of Public Health. So I realize that you are not at all in the medical field. You are not even at all in the field of biology, but you are in more environmental side. But what I'll do today is take HIV as a sort of a global health issue, and we will discuss not the science, but more the global problem that it causes, and how it affects all of us. And what you should know about it being in an academic institution here. I'll start by going back to something very simple, because I'll take you from 1985 to today. If I start in 1985, Naomi mentioned 1981 as the start. I will go back to that. because I would like to remind you that this famous actor, US actor, Rock Hudson, died in 1985. Perhaps none of you knows Rock Hudson. Who knows Rock Hudson? You know Rock Hudson? You know Rock Hudson, okay. None of the others know. Probably, in fact, you do not know Rock Hudson very well, but your mother or your grandmother loved Rock Hudson because he was the typical American hero that every American woman would love to marry. Okay, in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. He was so famous in all the movies he made, and he was really the perfect husband for American women. Okay? He never married. Okay? He never married, and his personal life was completely, blank. Nobody knew about his personal life. Fine. And in 1983, he became sick, and his disease was hidden. So he became sick, so nobody could see him anymore on movie. He became sick. His disease became mysterious. And in 1984, he was so sick that he decided to go to Paris to get treated. Okay, but nobody knew what he had. In fact, he had AIDS. Okay. And he had AIDS at a time where AIDS was a completely hidden problem that nobody would reveal to anybody. Even a famous actor like him could not reveal that he had AIDS. And of course that he had contracted AIDS through homosexual contact because he was a gay man, despite the fact that all the American women loved him. Okay. And he came to France because at that time the French researchers were a little bit more advanced than the American researchers, and there was some hope for treatment. And so he came to France, but obviously there was nothing for him better than for anybody else because we had no treatment at that time. And he realizes that he was going to die and decided to fly back to the US. But the rumor came at the surface at that time that he had AIDS. And AIDS in 1984 was a very frightening disease, potentially contagious. And the airline company simply refused to have him on board going back to the US because at that time he was known to have AIDS and that AIDS could be potentially transmissible to other individuals. I just take this as an example because just to tell you how AIDS was 25 or almost 30 years ago. Okay, somebody who had HIV could not go on a plane and travel normally because it was considered as a plague. You understand the word plague? Yes? Okay, so he couldn't go back home, and he was about to die. And because he was very rich, okay, what he did is simply chartered a Boeing 747 for himself because this was the only way for him to fly back to the US, okay, and go back to his home country to die, which he did a few weeks after going back to the US. He was buried in very also difficult situation because nobody wanted to bury him because he had revealed that he had HIV. Okay. So that's what the disease was in the 80s. Okay. Mysterious, frightening, no social response, and no medical response either because we didn't know a lot about this. Okay. So I want this to take this as a sort of a starting point and take you to today where the last statistic that I can share with you is that around the world at the moment there are almost 10 million people who are taking everyday antiretroviral drugs against this virus. Okay? So there are about 10 million people who today live almost normally with this virus, with treatment, and this treatment makes them living with a chronic disease almost like diabetes or hypertension or conditions like this. So you can just realize the change in paradigm, in approach that we have of a global problem from rejection, complete rejection in the early 80s to almost normal disease, but a disease that is absolutely enormous at the surface of the world, with 10 million people who need to take treatment every day to live with the virus. Okay, but that's still a success on its own. Any comment on that, or any question, or before I move to the content? Yes, please.
Just to give you some more context, I lived in New York City in the mid-1980s.
So 10 years later, yes?
No, in the mid-1980s.
Oh, okay, at that time, exactly. Okay.
Yeah. And in New York City, the disease in the homosexual community was very, very destructive. And I personally know individuals who died, and it was a very sudden death.
Yeah, I'll go back to that later. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so that's just to set the tone and set the scene. So what we'll do in today and next week lecture is just give you some updated information of where we are now in terms of the fight against HIV/AIDS. I think I'll do that today. And more importantly, perhaps, I would like not only to take the small example that I gave you of Rock Hudson, but explain to you what has happened in terms of not so much the science, but how we as individuals, societies, responded to this in the past 25 years. So do you understand how a health problem is analyzed, sort of a response is built, and how it's creating now the global response that we know. Then I put some challenges ahead of us, and I will try to focus more also on the biomedical prevention, certainly the next lecture, as a possible key for the future. But I will try to remain simple, as I know you are not in the medical field. So by the way, my slides will be available for you after the talk. So in between, you can share them so they can have them for the next lecture. Okay, so the first question is this a big problem today? And how is it affecting us globally? Okay, so you can access, like I did in preparing this lecture, the last UNAIDS report. It was released about 2 weeks ago. It's on the web. It's free, of course. And it's open access, I mean. And it was released because of the UN General Assembly in New York 2 weeks ago. The date was chosen for this purpose. First question is, what is UNAIDS? What do I mean by it was released by UNAIDS? What is UNAIDS? Do you know what it is? Yes.
It's a non-government organization funded by America.
Okay, so difference. That's not a non-governmental, that's a UN, United Nations agency. You know, you have the UN, which is the political, world assembly, okay? And then within the UN system, you have UN specialized agencies. So the World Health Organization deals at the surface of the globe with health problems. UNICEF deals with child and maternal problems. UNESCO, I know some of you went with Naomi to Paris recently, deals with more cultural and educational problems at the surface of the globe, okay? UNAIDS is the specialized agency of the UN nations that has to deal with a single problem, HIV/AIDS. And that's very interesting because that does not exist for any other problem, to have an agency that has to cope with all the aspects of a single problem, meaning that HIV/AIDS is not only a health problem. If it was a health problem, this will be strictly under the World Health Organization umbrella. Okay. But because HIV/AIDS is a societal, global problem with many, many components, it has a special way of looking at it from the UN perspective and the global perspective, and that's UNAIDS, okay? And that's UNAIDS is in Geneva. The agency is in Geneva. So the figures that I'm going to share with you, they were released just 2 weeks ago, so they are really up to date. And what do you find in this report? You find, first of all, the 3 key figures that you have to remember just in the order of magnitude, is that there are about 35 million of people who live with the virus on the surface of the globe, about 35 million of people living on the surface of the globe with this virus. You have about 2.3 million of people who just acquired infection in the past 12 months, just acquired infection in the past 12 months, meaning that out of the 35 million, 2.3 were just recent infections, okay? And in the same year, last year, there were about 1.6 million of people who died due to this disease at the surface of the globe, okay? So 3 simple figures. This has names in epidemiology. You don't need to know them, or maybe you will review them. It's called prevalence, incidence, mortality, okay? Or even mortality or lethality, okay? But the question here is more just to have an idea of the magnitude of the problem, okay? By just looking at these 3 figures, what would you say of the dynamic of the problem? Is this a problem that may look increasing, decreasing, stable, or you cannot tell? You would say stable? You would say increasing. Why do you say that? You are right, actually. Yeah. Yes. You have to think about a disease and a condition like this as a reservoir. Okay? It's a reservoir of people. In the reservoir, you have the people who happen to have the disease or the virus. It's not a disease, it's a virus. Okay? And you have the sort of the tap arriving in the reservoir. Okay? These are the new infections that are arriving. Okay? And you have about 2.3. And you have the bottom of the reservoir, the bottom of the sink, in which, unfortunately, people, the only way they have to quit the HIV infection status is to die. Because at the moment, that's also a very important message to begin with, there is no cure. Okay? Once you have the virus, you have it for life. May change in the future. I'll go back in my conclusions, but at the moment, that does not exist. Once you have the virus, you will carry it until you die. Okay? So you have people who unfortunately die of this virus and its complication. And you have 1.6 million. So you are right, there are less people escaping from the reservoir than people arriving in the reservoir. So yes, unfortunately today the epidemic at the global surface of the globe is still increasing. Okay? It's still increasing. Okay? That's a very simple message. Okay, that's a global, very global message that I'm giving you. Lots of million, hard even to figure out what does that mean. This many million people infected, million of deaths, million of people living with the virus. That's very sort of statistics. Okay, that doesn't tell you a lot. So let's put the statistics on a map, and I'll show you the 3 maps corresponding to the three aspects of what I described. And that's the map of what we call the prevalence, which means the burden of disease, the burden of infection that exists in the different parts of the world. So this 35.3 million that I have mentioned earlier, they are just displayed on the map by region of the world. Any comment? So we are here in East Asia, right? And what can you say? What can you see in general? Yes, sub-Saharan Africa disproportionately affected, because 25 out of 35, you can figure out that's an enormous burden, of course, because also the African continent has not such a big population. So both in terms of absolute number of people living with the virus and in terms of relation to the population, there is really an excess on the African continent that is absolutely obvious from this slide. What is the second part of the world where you find many more people than anywhere else? South and Southeast Asia. South and Southeast Asia. That's a lot of people living with the virus for a region like this. However, the problem is considered slightly less severe. Why? Why should we be less worried? Partly, yeah? Population, exactly, because in this part of the world, you have already the two big, populated countries, India and China. Okay, so we have an enormous amount of people living with the virus, but it's relative compared to the population, of course. But for the people living with HIV, that's an enormous problem. For those who have to take care of them, that's an enormous problem, numerically speaking. Okay, that's what I mean. Okay, clear enough for the display of the burden of disease in the world. Just to show you, about 2 years earlier, the global estimate was 34 million, which is less than what it is now. Okay, that means that in terms of burden, it's increasing, but you understood earlier that there were more people entering than people leaving. So you can understand that this is going in this direction, and I will even tell you later why it's going even further in expanding the size of number of people living with the virus. Is it fine? Okay. So the second item that I showed you was what we call in our jargon incidence. Incidence meaning acquisition of new infections. And I told you in 2012 it was about 2.3 million. Okay? And here again, this is where they show on the map. By region, exactly the same display of region. Comment? Is it any different from what I showed you with the burden of disease? Here we're talking of who arrives, who is newly infected. It's relatively similar. It's even more affecting the sub-Saharan continent than the other parts of the world. But still, the second part of the world, again, mostly affected by new infections, remains Asia. So, considering the population of Asia, that may not be a lot, but strictly speaking, that's a lot of acquisition of infection on the Asian continent, despite all the efforts to prevent transmission. Okay, so this is really a concern in these two parts of the world. And I should add, and of course I have a pointer, I forget. I should also add this part of the world that is really, really a preoccupation at the moment. That's Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Okay. Eastern Europe and Central Asia, this is not a big population. Okay, this is not a very big population. Many countries, but not a very, very big population. And still, you can see the dynamic of the epidemic is pretty high. Okay, lots of new infections happening. You know that all these countries, or almost all these countries, were in the former Soviet Union. Okay, when the Soviet Union was dismantled, these countries suffered from many changes, disruption in many of the public goods, okay, the public services, and prevention has been not really an issue in most of these countries, and certainly HIV/AIDS even less than many other problems. So this is probably the most worrisome part of the world today in terms of control of the epidemic, Eastern Europe and Central Asia. But still, of course, in terms of absolute numbers, Sub-Saharan Africa remains the most important part. Interesting note, if you compare what I have in 2012 to 2011, I chose 2 years that are just one after the other versus the previous one. I used a wider window. It was 2.5, now it's 2.3, meaning decrease, okay? It seems that there is less new infections in 2012 than there was a year earlier. Does that mean that we are on the right track? Like this? I will show you this a little bit later. Quite possible. Quite possible, in fact. Okay. That's a sort of instantaneous picture of 2012. That's the beginning of trying to show whether there is a trend over time that I try to show you. Okay. Yes. So I told you I found this global figure a little bit hard to understand. Even if I put them on a map, that remains a little bit theoretical, I would say. So I've chosen to show you another way, which is how much this acquisition of infection represents in a more concrete way. In a more concrete way, that means that every day of the year 2012, there were 6,300 infections, new infections in the world. So you can imagine at the end of the day, there will be more than 6,000 more infections in the world, in this planet, than there was yesterday. And so on every day. Just to give you the order of magnitude of what we are talking about. And almost all of them are in low and middle income countries. I don't need to, it's pretty obvious that there are almost none in a country like here, very few in countries like mine, in France, a little bit more in countries like the US or Canada. But all of this is peanuts compared to what happens in resource-limited settings. 95% of what is happening today are in this kind of countries. And also, a real concern, I'll explain this a little bit later, is that we still have quite a number of children that acquire infection as of today. And that's pretty, I would say, almost abnormal now because we have the tools to prevent them. About 10% or a little bit more than 10% of the new infections are infections in children. Okay. Okay, and here also again, the important point is that we still have a lot of women who acquire infection, almost as many women than men. And also a very big concern from the perspective of dynamic of a global problem like this is still a lot of people acquire their infection very young. Okay, that means that the vulnerability of populations remains, and the conditions of acquisition for young people also remain despite the many things that happen. You're basically in the generation that I'm talking about, so you know better, you understand better than me what I'm talking about here. Okay, yes?
Are the young children under 15, how are they becoming sick?
Yes. No, okay. Maybe I should be more specific. I'm talking of infections here. So I'm talking of acquiring a virus, harboring the virus, and you know that from there, you will live with the virus for life. Ultimately, you will develop complications. So the disease stage, even at the complicated stage that calls AIDS, okay? But we are talking of infections.
Infection, yeah,
okay.
Sorry.
So that brings me to one question that I'm going to ask you is, what do you know about the modes of transmission of this virus? What is known to you of the way this virus is transmitted? Yes. So you're talking here of the children. You're answering his question. Yes, most, if not all of these children acquire infection from the woman being pregnant and transmitting the virus either during the, most of the time, last part of pregnancy, during the delivery, and if she breastfeeds via the breast milk. Okay. So when I'm talking of the children who acquire infection here, I'm talking of children most of the time who acquire infection during even before they are born, just at the time of birth, or after that if they are breastfed. Okay, that's the mode of acquisition of the virus for children. Okay. What about the adults? What do we have today? Yes, sharing needles and basically any contaminated blood. Okay, so that's blood. Sexual activity in general, I would say. Okay. Either heterosexual or male homosexual. We have all evidence that these two modalities of transmission work perfectly well. Okay? Anything else? Because when I mentioned needles, you mentioned blood, so we have basically covered blood and sex. Okay? You have to realize that all of this, and mother to child. Okay? You have to realize that all of this has been known since, I would say, 1983. Okay? So this is 30 years that we know how this virus is transmitted. 30 years that we have relatively obvious ways of reduce the risk of transmission. I'll come back to that in my next talk. And we certainly do not do enough when you see the dynamic that I am describing here. That's pretty obvious. But there is nothing new under the sun in terms of modes of transmission of the virus than there was 30 years ago. Okay, the virus is transmitted by the blood and related products. The virus is transmitted by sex, whatever the kind of sex you have, and the virus is transmitted from mother to child. Okay, and it's not very efficient. So the capacity of the virus to be transmitted, of this virus to be transmitted, is not very, very good. Imagine if it was good. Okay. So for instance, it's much less easy to transmit this virus than to transmit the virus of hepatitis B, for instance. Okay. So we're almost lucky that this virus is not terribly transmissible. But still, you can understand now the dynamic of this epidemic, which is enormous. Okay, I think I have given you enough figures. Just the figure of death is relatively similar in the sense that 1.6 million deaths are spread almost exclusively in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. It's very comparable to what I described for the new infections. So the exit of the reservoir is relatively similar. And again, a slight trend toward improvement with slightly less death now than there was a year ago. But you will understand that in a minute. Okay? I think I've given you enough figures. If you look at the report, you will find plenty of figures, plenty of graphs, plenty of tables. Okay? But if you capture some of these, you have understand pretty much what is happening. And what is happening in sort of conclusion of what the slides that I show you is that we have what we call a pandemic. What is a pandemic? What does that mean? What do I mean by pandemic? The definition of a pandemic, if you know this word, or if you don't know it, you can imagine. Disease spreading relatively quickly, but more importantly, spreading everywhere. Okay? Pandemic. It comes from the Greek, and that means that it's spreading everywhere, all countries. Okay. At the beginning, we were talking of an epidemic because we didn't know in how many countries, for how long it will be. Now we are in a sort of more durable process and everywhere. So that's called really a pandemic. So you have seen the reservoir, you have seen the entry in the reservoir, you have seen the exit, and you have concluded that it was dynamic. Okay? And I agree with you. And if it's dynamic, that means that despite our efforts, we are not controlling very well the global situation, you know. Our politicians do not control very well our economy, but the public health specialists must confess that they do not control very well the HIV pandemic at the moment. But this is not only a public health issue. That's a global issue with many aspects that we will touch later on. Okay, so I think the politicians are as responsible of the lack of control of the HIV pandemic than the public health specialists. Comment? No?
I would say that the politicians are irrelevant.
They are irrelevant?
Yes, because they don't have the solution.
They don't have
The politicians don't have the solution to such a kind of problem. It is science and medicine that can provide an actual solution to this kind of problem. The politics has nothing to do with it.
Okay,
So,
okay. Well, keep this comment for later when I show you some arguments.
Okay.
Okay?
I'm sorry.
I can show you during my lecture that some politicians have been counterproductive in the fight against AIDS. Very counterproductive. I'll go to this later on. And that at the moment, they are not proactive enough to help and to basically help us to do what we recommend to do. Okay? So I don't want to feel them guilty, but I can say that most of them are not proactive enough, I would say. Okay? But we will touch that later on if you want. Okay, so that's where I put the global statistics that I just present. And you may wonder when I started to tell you that the figures of 2012 were slightly better than 2011, for instance, where this could, for mortality and for acquisition of new infections. I show you that these two numbers looked slightly better in 2012 than 2011. And this comes from a last decade effort, I have to be honest. And this last decade effort is the introduction of antiretroviral treatment, antiretroviral drugs that target the virus. Okay? These cocktails of drugs that target the virus. Okay? You know what I'm talking about? You have heard about that. Okay. You have, yes? ARVs, antiretroviral drugs, or ART for antiretroviral treatment. Okay? And what I want you to understand from now on is that these drugs target well the virus. They are more and more efficient. They are less and less toxic. But they do not kill the virus. They just control it. Okay? And that's why, despite the fact that this is a major change of the last decade, I told you on the first slide, almost 10 million people treated. We are talking of a treatment that does not kill the virus. this is not like all the other infectious diseases that you know, like the sore throat you may have and for which you take antibiotics, or the severe infection that you may have and require an hospitalization, and after an infusion of antibiotics, maybe a week, 2 weeks, you will be cured. Okay? For HIV, that does not exist. That's a very special infectious disease with this respect. But my take-home message is that this treatment has made an enormous difference to the life of people living with HIV and to the dynamic of the epidemic. Okay? So, why has it made the life of numerous people very different? Simply because at the end of 2002, about 10 years ago, there was almost nobody on the surface of the globe who was taking antiretroviral drugs. Okay? I'll take you back to the history a little bit later, but the treatments, the ARVs that she was referring to, they appeared somewhere here in 1996. From 1996 to end of 2002, there were a few 100,000 people, a few thousand people even, treated in the US, in Japan, in Canada, in Australia, and nobody else elsewhere. Okay. And then all of a sudden in 2002, or 2003, it started. And the first country that started is in blue here. And what you can see here, it's in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I don't know if you know which country I'm talking about. Probably not. Because this is a single country that has started here and that started the process. That was Brazil. Okay? And why Brazil? Because Brazil at that time had a serious epidemic, lots of cases, difficult to control, a lot of vulnerable populations. But the politicians of Brazil, I'm going back to the politicians, make the decision that although the treatments were extremely expensive at that time, extremely expensive, they said we can no longer afford to see our citizens dying of this disease in the context of Brazil that is changing. The society of Brazil is changing. And they decided to invest into drug purchase and treating people. Okay. That's the very first country here that you see making a difference outside of the rich countries. Okay. And what has happened since then, under many mechanisms that I will describe later, the face of the world has completely changed. And what you have at the end of 2009 is a huge number of people treated, more than 5 million here, okay? And what is the red part of the bar? Africa. Africa, there was nobody treated in 2002, nobody, okay? 7 years later, several million of people treated, okay? So really, the complete approach of all of this has completely changed. Okay, completely changed. Okay? And if I go a step further, I told you it's 9.7, almost 10 million as of December 2012. So you see my slide won't work because to continue to put 2012, I need to go outside of the graph because that's a sort of different scale now. Because now it's 10, here it's 5, so 10 will take me somewhere like this. So you see, it's you know this as scientists, it is an exponential curve. So the curve of new people that are put on treatment today is still exponential. We treat an enormous amount of people every year, and more in a very, very rapid way. And most of them are in Africa. And you're not surprised, because I showed you on the map earlier that the cases were there. Okay? So we are really treating people who need treatment in the right place. Okay? Makes a huge difference to what it was before. Am I clear? Okay. So that's treatment. You were mentioning mother-to-child transmission. Here you have a sort of a less attractive figure, but still, it's not too bad. About 62% of pregnancy of women who are living with the virus today receive antiretrovirals to prevent mother-to-child transmission. 62%, okay? And we estimate that about 50%, 49 to be precise, take some sort of ARV drugs during breastfeeding. Because we know that in resource-limited settings, breastfeeding is the usual way to feed babies. These babies that are at risk, well, as of today, we are capable of giving drugs to about half of these women. Okay? So I show you the adults. I show you now the pregnant woman. That tells you quite a bit on the progress that have been made. Okay? So, conclusions of what I just showed you, it looks like in terms of activities, I would say, public health programs, at least for the use of drugs, we are making great progress. Okay, we are making great progress. But still, I showed you these enormous numbers of millions of people newly infected, millions of deaths. That still, we have done part of the job. We have not finished the job. So we are still optimistic because not only in terms of activities, but in terms of results, we are seeing something happening. Okay. Again, that's the incidence, that's the new infection. I showed you where we were in 2012. I put a footnote saying, yes, it was slightly worse in 2011, so meaning that we are sort of in the downward trend. If you look at 10-year or even 12-year of information, you can see this very, very spectacular, almost spectacular trend, okay? That although this is still very active, I must admit that more than 2 million people infected every year. This is an enormous amount of new infection. This is much, much better than it was about 12 or 10 years ago. I don't know if, I cannot be reassured, but I can say, especially if I talk to politicians, that we're on the right track, assuming that we continue the efforts like we have done them and probably expand them. Okay? Will you agree with my conclusion that we are on the right track, but that we have only done half of the job? Half of the job. And it's going to take a lot of efforts and a lot of time to get somewhere here. That's the problem. Okay? It's not going to happen just like this. It's just not going to happen one day. That if I come back, if Naomi invites me next year, I can tell you that the curve will not be here. I'm sure about that. Okay? She needs to invite me at least 20 more years before it reaches, the bottom of the graph. Okay? And if we believe it should reach the bottom of the graph, we need to make a lot of efforts. Okay? Lots of efforts. Efforts at individual level, prevention from your own risk, each of you, and global efforts, because all of this requires a lot of efforts from many, many perspectives. Okay, but it's very, very good. We have never been that good, to be honest. Okay, I'm slightly optimistic today. Okay, let me take you to my country for a minute. And how does what I showed you translate in my own country, France? France has a pretty good health system, okay? Social security, universal medical coverage, access to all the services, preventive and curative, okay? Lots of campaign of prevention against HIV/AIDS since the mid-80s, okay? My generation has been exposed. The next generation has been exposed. Your generation is exposed. Still, we estimate that in my country, between 7,000 and 800 people acquire infection each year. Okay. For me, I'm sure you would agree, this is unacceptable. Because these contaminations, people are acquiring an infection for life, with the need to be treated for life, and with the need to have special consideration for themselves and their partners for life. Okay. And today, we should be able to reduce this to zero even more easily than the big global world curve that I showed you earlier. It's still that does not happen. So I'm optimistic from the previous slide, okay, very optimistic to say we will do it. And when we show you what happens in my country, I'm not so optimistic or I'm not so proud, okay, because in my country we have partly failed at the moment, having still, an unacceptable number of contaminations. Although you will agree that 8,000 out of the 2.3 million at the surface of the globe, that's nothing, huh? That's absolutely nothing. But still, this is unacceptable, like it is unacceptable in Japan as well. And more frightening, there is one single group in France, the men who have sex with men, in whom the epidemic is starting again. What I mean by start again is that it's much more dynamic than it was a few years ago. Okay? Men who have sex with men. And we estimate in France that if you are an MSM, in the general population of France, probably many of them live in, they are usually in the more socio-economic, preserved groups. They live in rather larger cities, okay, where it's socially more acceptable. Well, at the moment, at least in some parts of France and in Paris in particular, we have good data to estimate that if you are an MSM living in Paris, your risk of acquiring HIV at the current level of protection that people take is about 1% per year. 1% per year. Can you imagine that? I mean, that's almost as bad as being an heterosexual person living in the city of Johannesburg in South Africa, which is really the heart of the world epidemic. Okay. For political reasons, I'll go back to this later. So let's not ignore that in countries like probably Japan, I'm sure this happens in some small parts of Tokyo, and certainly in a city like Paris, at the moment, prevention does not work in very special groups where the epidemic is today concentrated. Okay. And this concentration of epidemic in some special groups makes most of the new contaminations that I just described here. Okay? Yes? Yeah, please.
Just to make it clear.
You're saying that, well, first of all, that data is kind of old. It's from 2008. Are those levels the same?
No. It's unfortunately stable.
It is stable for this year. And you're
saying...
saying...
it's stable for the past, I would say, 10 years. We have had a good quality of information, repeated information every year, and we estimate that each year since 2004, we roughly had the same number of new contaminations each year.
And you're saying the source of those new contaminations is homosexual sexual activity?
I wouldn't say the source. What I would say is that the MSM group is disproportionately affected by acquisition of HIV compared to the rest of the population.
So a lot of the population is acquiring the virus through intravenous drugs as well? Or? No.
Intravenous drug transmission has almost disappeared in France since the end of the 80s.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Okay, yeah. And heterosexual transmission has remained limited, has been mostly in link to those coming from countries of high endemicity, mostly sub-Saharan Africa, okay? So that's a distinct epidemic. But what is driving today the rest of the epidemic in France is the MSM group, which a few years ago was at a very nice downward trend that is no longer present. Okay. And what I described for France is the same in certain parts of the US, in the UK, in most European countries. So we are not totally controlling the situation, and certainly not in vulnerable populations. Okay?
Japan is safe.
Yeah. Yes.
Japan is not stable, increasing a little bit.
Yeah.
Still increasing. HIV in Japan. And major part is MSM.
Yeah. So we should not be neither proud nor being, not consider that this is a problem, because this remains a problem, and this remains a problem at absolutely unacceptable levels in our countries. Of course, we have to deal with a completely different epidemic than in Africa, but still we have a dynamic epidemic. Okay. Children, you mentioned prevention to mother to child. I showed you that many women around the world were now receiving antiretroviral drugs while they were pregnant or breastfeeding. This is the curve of how the new pediatric HIV infections have occurred in the world since the beginning of 2001. And I think this is quite interesting, isn't it? Because the curve, the drop in the curve of the new pediatric infections is becoming steeper and steeper. And here, Naomi doesn't need to invite me 20 years. We do believe that we are on the right track to go to zero or something close to zero, I would say in the next 5 years. Okay, worldwide. In fact, if there is a round red circle here, this is because UNAIDS and the UN agencies in general have set the objective of elimination of pediatric HIV infection. This is the first time in the history of HIV/AIDS that we are pronouncing the word elimination. But that's only for one specific mode of transmission, which is mother to child. And this word elimination is maybe a bit misleading, because I'm afraid we will never avoid 100% of the cases. But we are getting very close to the zero target that we have here. Okay? So next generation of students may see a curve going very close to this target. Okay? Very good. So I talked about the African situation already on the different maps. This is clear that the situation for the African continent, between the 25 million of people living with the virus, the 1.6 million new infections, the children infected, the death, is very specific. And seen from Japan, it looks like it's another world, but yes, indeed, it is another world in terms of magnitude of the epidemic. Which is interesting is that, as I said, the new infections are decreasing rapidly. This is particularly true also for children, and also the number of deaths are starting to decrease as well. So all the indicators that I showed you at the sort of the global level, they worked well on the African continent, which has the heaviest burden from all the continents. So really, what's happening at the global level is really reflected in what's happening in Africa. So Africa is not left behind. That's what I want to convey here in terms of message. But Africa is complex. Africa is complex. From Japan, I can mention Africa, but Africa, West Africa is different from Southern Africa. Even within Southern Africa, countries are different. And within one country, you can have very specific type of, particularities or specificities of the epidemic. Here I showed you two things. I'll show you two countries, a country in West Africa called Ghana, and a little country in southern Africa called Swaziland. Okay? And what you can see here is the distribution of modes of acquisition, likely mode of acquisition of the virus in these two countries. You cannot see the details necessarily, I don't know from the back, but what you can see is that the different bars are different. Okay? So what happens in Ghana, for instance, is not exactly what happens in Swaziland. And even in the two Swaziland studies here, you don't have exactly also the same pattern. So this is what we call know your epidemic. Know your epidemic, meaning, okay, there are global figures. There are ways of transmission that we have known for 30 years. But the social conditions of the environment in which people live are so different, and the response is so different, that the epidemic doesn't go in the same groups everywhere. Okay? As I told you in France, it goes primarily today to MSM. Okay? You can see that in Ghana, that's not the same than in Swaziland. Okay? And interestingly enough, do you see MSM here in yellowish? They are here, they are here, they are here. Okay? Is this well known that MSM is commonly practiced in African populations? No. We had a very sort of traditional, old-fashioned belief that in Africa, male homosexual encounters are inexistent. That's a belief. That's something that has been in the textbooks. There are no gay men in Africa. Stupid, isn't it? I mean, stupid in principle. But we have lived on this myth for decades. Okay? Once you start to really study that and document that, you understand that in Ghana and in Swaziland, there are MSM. There are very few MSM. But they are disproportionately affected by the epidemic. In fact, they are very often bisexuals because they hide their homosexuality. Okay? And they are so much hidden in the population that they are very difficult to target from a prevention standpoint. Okay? And we have been discovering over the past 5 years that having specific prevention programs targeted to MSM in Africa was probably very important to limit the spread of the epidemic. Whereas we believed 10 years ago that there was no MSM activity. If there was no MSM activity, then there was no need to prevent infection in MSM. Okay? And we are now agreeing that this is not the case. Okay. Yes? Yes?
The MSM transmission can be actually higher than the numbers show because people are hiding so much and they are not openly admitting that this is the way.
You are absolutely right. We have discovered over the past 5 years that MSM was a practice, that MSM people were at risk, that they were at higher risk than the general population. And when we have started to document how frequent they were HIV positive, they are enormously positive compared to those who are heterosexuals. And again, this is only documented in those who accept to enter in these studies, to accept to be tested, to accept possibly to enter into care. So yes, we are underestimating the magnitude of the epidemic in MSM in Africa. It's probably the same in Eastern Europe, exactly the same for the same reason. Social pressure that doesn't allow people to express themselves as MSM. And the fact that we are not targeting them because they are just invisible. Okay. You're absolutely right. Okay. Very last comment on the global estimates. there is this paradoxical effect that you may have noticed. You know, I've talked to you about this very positive figure that I showed you. You know, the new infections are decreasing year after year. And I showed you that's good news. And in 20 years from now, we should be to zero or close to zero. Not before, unless a major scientific breakthrough happens. But what happens with the people living with HIV? I just showed you the recent trend, and now I'm showing you the trend over 10 years. This increases. The number of people living with HIV increases. What's the reason? You understood that the reservoir, there were plenty of people arriving, there were less deaths. Okay, but what's the reason? This is exactly because I showed you that 10 million people were treated, okay? So people, of course, acquire less and less infection, but still very active. They enter in the reservoir, but contrary to 2001, now when they enter the reservoir, they are very likely to be tested, or more likely to be tested than they were before. And if they are tested, they are much more likely to get treatment. If they get treatment, I'll come back to this later, they survive, they live almost normally, so they stay longer in the reservoir. Yes?
How about when people know that HIV can be cured or to extend their life?
Yes?
How about the lack of awareness?
Yes, you're talking of something different. Or you're saying, okay, if these people more and more people get treated here, they are going to live longer, and that's why I see the reservoir increasing. But you are concerned that if they live longer with treatment, they feel better, they could sort of relax their behavior and have what we call in our language sexual disinhibition. Is this what you are thinking about? Sexual disinhibition meaning, okay, if, you know, I am HIV, I have a treatment, I feel well, okay, I should no longer use condoms, and I should have more partners than I had before, because that's worth doing. Okay? This is what you meant?
I mean that the other person who say that this it's okay, but if I get HIV, I can be treated.
Yes. Okay. Or the other thing is that, okay, you are negative. You know what condom is about. You are sick of using condoms, but you say, okay, if I get infected, who cares? I'll get treated. Okay. The two things today have not exactly happened. What you are describing here may happen, and may happen in specific groups. We do believe that MSM, for instance, at least in industrialized countries, tend to reverse their preventive efforts on the grounds that you are describing, saying, okay, what a big deal if I get infected because I will get treated. Okay. So we need to pass the message. We need to pass the message very clear, and we are not doing it enough, that fine, you may get infected, but if you get infected, you have to treat yourself for life. It's going to be complex. It's going to be very challenging, and you need to prevent infection to your future partners. So that's not an easy life. That's certainly not worth taking the risk. Okay? And these messages are much harder to pass in the new generation than it was 10 or 15 years ago, when if you were a young gay person, you were likely to be exposed around you to people who were treated and for whom it was difficult, or to know people who got sick, and now does not exist anymore. So you don't feel as well. So you're right, and this is our global responsibility to pass these messages in a way that is appropriate to this new setting. The second question is whether people who are on treatment could be disinhibited, have sex with more people, etc. The answer is today no. That does not exist. Okay. It has been studied many times. Maybe I'll show you this later. We have never found that. People are not totally crazy, you know. Okay. And irrespective of the country, we have never found these kind of things happening. Okay. Okay. I'll finish again by this. So we have the explanation that people acquire infections still at a high speed. People die less. And what happened is that more and more people are tested and treated, and that's why the reservoir is increasing. In France, just to finish, there were about 7,000 to 8,000 new cases a year, less than 1,000 deaths per year. So now it's really almost nothing. And we estimate that we have almost 150,000 people who live with the virus, just to give you an idea. 35 million on the surface of the globe. In a country like mine, so 62 plus millions of people, about 150,000 people live with the virus. Yes?
Talking about France.
Yes?
Like you said, like MSM 1% and
1% acquisition of risk per year.
Per year.
Yes.
So it's like.
But I don't know exactly what the size of the MSM population is in France. You know, it's not on your identity card.
Yeah, that's true. But I think like MSM might be in increasing trend.
Yes.
And that must be much more vulnerable.
Yes.
And so what do you think, like any solution or any precaution method for that group?
Yes, that will be part of my second talk. But there are many things that are happening today that could happen in the future that could contribute to the control. Yes. So it's not out of control. Simply today the control is not satisfactory. That's what I want to say. And let's just to highlight, because we have pretty good figures in my country. So 150,000 people. We do believe that today about 29,000, to simplify, do not know that they are positive. So we estimate that in France we have a target of finding in France 29,000 people who have the virus and who don't even know that they have it. Meaning that we need to test, to not to chase them. I don't like the word, but you understand, to try to get them as early as possible. In addition, we know that there are almost 10,000 who are already positive, know it, they have been at least once through the test, but sort of refuse to be treated, or at the moment don't want to be treated, or have good reasons, social vulnerability, for instance, not to be treated. And again, in a country where social security is universal medical coverage, no theoretical restriction to be treated. And treatment is free, I should also say it. Okay. But still, we estimate that about 10,000 people positive, known to be positive, are not in treatment, and about 29,000 not even know that they are tested, not even know that they are positive. Okay, very good. Just a word to finish the where are we now with the tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is another disease that is extremely important at the surface of the globe and that has a clear link with HIV/AIDS. Okay? Why? Because the tuberculosis bacillus is very common among people living with HIV because of the alteration of their immune system. And these two epidemics have sort of merged. Okay? And in the 1990s, early 2000, we were concerned that at the surface of the world, tuberculosis will explode, okay, because of HIV. Because we have been treating a lot of people now, we see this very nice curve, downward curve of less and less tuberculosis deaths. And again, this is really due to the fact that we are treating more and more people with ARVs, so we are keeping them in good shape. Therefore, they have much less risk to have tuberculosis or to reactivate their tuberculosis, and they have less risk to die of tuberculosis. Okay. Again, that's an unexpected or somewhat unexpected effect of ART that we finally see after many, many years of struggle against tuberculosis. And tuberculosis has another problem that I will just mention to you as a sort of a global issue, is that we still have a big concern. This is the resistance of the drugs to the resistance of the bacillus to the drugs that we use, the antibiotics that we use against tuberculosis. And probably HIV has contributed to the spread of the what we call multi-drug resistance and extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis at the surface of the globe, and especially on the African continent. And unfortunately, the ARVs have not been able to, slow down or counteract against that. Okay, we have been a bit long because you asked me a lot of questions, and that's good. So it's almost finished, right? Almost? Yeah. So I can just briefly start for a few minutes the how do we get here, in the sense that I would like to discuss with you the sort of the 30 years of what happened. Okay? Not from the medical perspective, but more the societal and global perspective of what you should think about global health. So I don't know, maybe Naomi, maybe the simplest is that I stop here and start all over again with this new section next week. What do you think? Okay. So I will discuss with you how do we get here and the challenges, again, in a very interactive way. But I will touch, how the society responded to this, not how the scientists did. So you can think about this in the, population and environment. Any question on that already, or any point you would like to make? No? Okay, so we see each other next week. I don't know which Tuesday. Is that Tuesday? Tuesday.
No, Wednesday. Tuesday. Yeah,
8. 8. So it's Tuesday. Tuesday. Same time? Okay, excellent. Okay, so you can share the PowerPoint in advance.
Yes.
Okay.
The PowerPoint file on our EDL website. Please access to the EDL website. Maybe tomorrow it will be available.
Okay, thank you very much.